Hello and welcome to Innovation Celebration, the show where we celebrate recent advancements in science and technology, the people and ideas that make them possible, and the ways in which they benefit human flourishing. I'm Angelica Worth.
And I'm Thomas Walker, and I would like to start us off somewhat recovering some ground that we covered on episode 2 a little while ago now, talking about nuclear fusion and specifically a breakthrough that's been made at the National Ignition Facility, where they've really achieved quite an astonishing improvement in the energy output from nuclear fusion reactions. Using lasers to trigger the reaction. So I'll get a bit more into detail in that on that shortly. But firstly, just a word about the NIF. So this is a facility that takes up an area of about 3 football fields, apparently, at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory or laboratory, as you guys I think say, in San Francisco. And this is a state body, but they're mainly focused on military research. So
which is a perfectly legitimate function of government.
Yeah, it's actually getting some flack really at the moment because this is a really important breakthrough. But people are saying, oh, but it's in the interest of developing weaponry and stuff. And it's like, well, firstly, military applications are wider than just weaponry. This could be power source for vehicles and all sorts of things. But also, that's an important thing to do. You need to stay ahead of your enemies, and certainly in a global situation where that's quite important at the moment. But then those military technologies have wider applications as well. The jet engine was a military technology, things like that, end up having massive benefits. And the benefit of nuclear fusion, I will come on to, but is fairly obvious, I think. Well, actually, I'll come on to that now. As you discussed, I will summarize a little because you kind of went over this in episode 2 already, but at the moment, nuclear power plants operate on what's called nuclear fission, FISSION, not fishing. And that's where you split apart an atom of a heavy element like uranium or plutonium, an unstable isotope, and bring it down to a more stable form usually. But the result of that is a lot of radioactive waste that has really, really long half-lives. So so some of those isotopes of uranium and plutonium have half-lives stretching into the billions of years. So this is stuff that's going to be radioactive basically forever. Half-life is the amount of time it takes for half of the material to decay, and then the same amount of time for the half of what's left to decay, and it just basically stretches out ad infinitum. So
and it's a smaller amount as well, isn't it, that fusion produces versus fission? Like just a physical amount?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, but that would be something for our viewers to Google into potentially. But the point is that the radioactive waste from fusion is much quicker to decay. It may indeed be a smaller amount, I'm not certain. But fusion, as the name sort of suggests, works in the opposite direction. It brings together 2 atoms, usually isotopes of hydrogen, to form helium. Now, this is the process that goes on in the centers of stars, as we've talked about a couple of times before. And they fuse hydrogen to helium, as the sun is doing at the moment. When they run out of hydrogen, they fuse helium and then into lithium, and then that goes on and on down the line, usually as far as iron. But it's really just the hydrogen into helium that we're interested in, or they use isotopes like deuterium and tritium, which are hydrogen with extra subatomic particles added in, basically, so that they're variants of hydrogen, really. And so I'll come on to specifically what this experiment is doing, which is that there's a number of ways you can try to trigger a fusion reaction. And the problem that we have with fusion reactors, because obviously there's so much, the fact they're safer and potentially more powerful than fission reactors is, there would be such a wonderful solution to the push for clean energy and safe energy, but more importantly, in a sense, reliable and plentiful energy. And so there's a number of ways the problem they have is that usually the energy you need to put in to trigger the reaction is more than you get out of the reaction. So it just ends up being uneconomical. And there's a number of different ways that they've tried starting the reaction to try and get around that problem. So this is what's called confinement. They're trying to encourage the atoms together. And they've tried doing that magnetically, they've tried doing it electronically, they've tried doing it by bombarding the thing with charged particles. But this particular experiment used lasers. So they used high-powered lasers to zap this little container about the size of a peppercorn, containing deuterium and tritium. I'm not entirely sure on the pronunciation of that, but they zapped this little thing with lasers and produced an energy output of 10 quadrillion watts, which, to put that in sort of cognizable terms, is 6% of all of the energy that hits the Earth from the sun at any given time. So the entire half of the sphere of the Earth that's facing the sun, all of the solar energy from, the gigantic fusion reactor that is the sun, that's hitting the Earth, 6% of that on the entire Earth's surface, and it released that energy in 1/100th of a second. So 1/100th trillionth of a second. So that's an inordinate amount of energy in a tiny amount of time. So that in itself is impressive, but what really sort of makes this experiment more noteworthy is that they are able to sustain the reaction after the initial input of energy. So it wasn't just, you did that and you got an energy release. The fusion carried on. They started to set up a continuing fusion reaction. And I tried to find out how long the reaction ran for, but I couldn't find that anywhere. So there's still a point of unclarity. Clearly it stopped at some point, because the problem still remains that it isn't quite yet at the point where it's producing more energy than they put in. However, it has moved so much closer to that as a result of this. So they're saying that they got 1,000 times more energy out of this than was the case 10 years ago, 25 times more than was the case in 2018, and 8 times more than at the beginning of this year. So, and
this is moving
now
exponentially.
Yeah, and Arthur Turrell, who worked on the project, he's saying that this phenomenal breakthrough brings us tantalizingly close to a demonstration of what he calls net energy gain, he puts it in quotes, from fusion reactions. So he's saying, that curve has brought us just within spitting distance of being at the point where more energy comes out than you put in, which is the point where it becomes, profitable. It's just no point trying to get energy from, a situation where you're putting more in than you get out. It's just totally irrational. It's just a net loss. So you might as well have us all on bicycles powering generators at that point. So it just doesn't make any sense. He wrote a book, by the way, about the entire project called The Star Builders: Nuclear Fusion and the Race to Power the Planet. And the reason he calls it the Star Builders is this is what these effectively are. They're little artificial suns, but in order for them to function like that, or are you going to say something?
I was just going to say that sounds really cute. The idea of little suns. Like, I know astronomically stars are giant balls of gas, but it's like twinkle, twinkle, little star. It sounds adorable. But that book we'll link to in the description if anyone's curious.
Yeah. So this is a little fiery nuclear reaction, but you can think of it in cuter terms if you want to. But no, in order it to be a sort of artificial sun, then it does need to have that continuing reaction. It can't just be a case of you have to put the energy in every time you want the energy out. So I say this is a really important breakthrough, and this makes me hopeful that actual practical fusion reactors are a lot closer than we might have thought they were, and that could give us real sustainable. Sustainable is a problematic word in some sense, but I mean in its most literal sense of, we can keep doing this. So what sustainable originally meant is we can sustain the activity, like, the kind of power we need to be able to generate enough to keep improving our standard of living.
Sure.
And keep growing as a civilization. So I think it's just a really, really exciting prospect. And, I will talk very briefly about the sort of opposition to nuclear power, which is bizarre to me. Like, just, it's such an obviously good solution.
And it's valid to be concerned about safety, but there are a number of pretty good solutions out there to the issue of containing radioactive waste. Like, yes, that is an issue, but it's an issue that's been largely solved. So
I mean, it's almost like, so I understand that the Chernobyl disaster scared a lot of people, but if one Russian airliner fell out of the sky because it was badly built, would you never trust a plane again? Like,
if you're curious about more of the events that went into the Chernobyl disaster, I would definitely Without going too into depth, I will say that they were primarily political, not scientific, and you can get
Yeah.
into that with the HBO miniseries Chernobyl. Fair warning, it is pretty gruesome. I was a little nauseated at some points, so it's not for the faint of heart. But if you want to get into that, that's a series that's well worth watching. It's like 6 episodes.
Yeah, and sort of what I'm getting at with that comparison, because obviously there's sort of different scales of events, but the point there is that the issue isn't with the concept of nuclear power. The issue there was with the management and maintenance of that facility.
Precisely.
And I think that came coupled with this kind of post Hiroshima, like 1950s sci-fi films and things like that, where there was just this really, and the Cold War era, basically, fear of nuclear war, fear of everything radioactive, and this mentality that radiation is just this thing to be feared. And there's such a level of misunderstanding of what radiation even is. Like you are bathed in radiation. There's the ground beneath your feet is radioactive. There is radiation from the sun, from other stars. There's radiation just in our bodies, in just radioactive materials that are in our bloodstream all the time. There's radio waves, there's microwaves, there's all the stuff from our technology, but that is a relatively small slice of the pie. You can get, if you look online, there are pie charts of just your normal radiation exposure, which comes from all sorts of just natural sources all the time, and neutrinos and all sorts of things, just from space, from the ground. So visible light and heat are forms of radiation. You wouldn't be able to feel the warmth on your skin. You wouldn't be able to see anything without radiation. It's just that we associate radiation with this horrifically poisonous gamma rays that come from nuclear blasts and things like that. But it's actually if you go into nuclear power stations, you can stand and look at the reactors. They're underwater, but the water is enough to stop the radiation. Like it's just nowhere near as dangerous as people think it is, as long as you don't cut corners on running the things and don't site them where there's going to be tsunamis. Then and those aren't comparable disasters by any means. There's very different situations that those happened in, and the result was very different. But they are a very safe way to generate power. And it's a technology that's always going to exist. You're never going to not have nuclear technology, and I don't know why you'd want that. So that's not my little rant about that. But
it's an exciting step forward, and those were some valid points there about nuclear power. So the thing I wanted to focus on first today is a development in the field of managing prosthetics. Specifically, this is a development and a technology that would allow you to control a prosthetic limb using magnets. So to lay out the problem that this technology is designed to solve, when you have a prosthetic limb, you typically don't have a lot of control over it. Obviously, the old-fashioned ones that are just plastic and metal, you have very minimal control over whatsoever. The cutting edge right now, prior to this development in prosthetics, was called electromyography. And it was called that, electromyography, because it involved implanting sensors into the remaining part of the limb, and those sensors would pick up on the electrical activity of the muscles, hence electromyography.
So they're sort of picking up the sense, like the signals that your body is sending to the muscle and trying to
translate that,
which is amazing in itself.
Yes, I'm not trying to poo-poo that technology. It's not bad. It's a step forward, but now we have another step forward. So the limitation of those prosthetics, besides the fact that implanting these sensors is really invasive surgery. So that's a pain. But the other problem is, if you're only picking up the electrical impulses, what you're not picking up on is the length that the muscles have contracted, or the speed at which they're contracting. And so if I'm going to move my hand, right, I can move it all the way, I can move it part of the way, and so on. But how much I move it depends on how long my muscles are extending and contracting. And that's the type of thing that with an electromyographic prosthetic, they don't get that detail.
So they because I've seen videos about this, like people can to some extent get dexterity and movement out. I assume that's just them learning how to play the system. It's a bit like when you drive an automatic car and you kind of get a sense of what you need to push the pedal a certain way to encourage it to change gear. It's kind of like that, isn't it? You sort of learn how to.
Right. You learn how to manipulate it, but it's quite a steep learning curve. So that's the other downside of it, is that if somebody who's just had an amputation getting this limb is going to have nowhere near the functionality they used to.
Yeah.
So at MIT's Media Lab, a team led by Professor Hugh Hare and postdoc Cameron Taylor are working on a project. And a quick note about who's providing the funding here. MIT is a public university, which I have my own issues with, but this particular project was funded in part by private charity. So with this project, how it actually works is they use these little magnetic beads that have a coating on them to make them safe to be in the human body. And they implant them into the remaining muscle in the limb that has been amputated. These little beads pick up on not only when a muscle is moving, but how much it's moving, how fast it's moving in the remaining limb, shoots that information out to these little credit card sized sensors, which could be put on the clothing or the skin of the individual. And those then relay the information to the prosthetic so that it can move accordingly. And this happens very fast. In milliseconds. This was actually Hare and Taylor's original. Was that going to be your question?
No, I was just trying to picture that process. I hadn't quite clicked that it was going from the sensor out to the device and then back into the prosthetic.
Yeah, no, it's a three-part thing. The beads, the sensors, the prosthetic, and we'll link. They've made a little animation of how it works. It's like 2 minutes long. We'll link that in the description as well if anyone else wants to see it visually. But yeah, so this happens very quickly, this whole communication process. That was Hare and Taylor's project in I think it was 2018. They did a project where they developed an algorithm to cut that time down that it takes for that communication to happen, such that it happens now in milliseconds. So
sort of fast enough for it to be imperceptible for the user.
Yeah, you're not going to notice a lag of milliseconds.
Yeah.
And so they're calling this technology magnetomicrometry. And because magnetomicrometry is quite the mouthful, they've nicknamed it MM.
I'm sure there's nothing else in the world that uses the acronym MM.
Absolutely not. And the precision that this system has been able to achieve so far is remarkable. It's precise to about the width of a human hair. That's the margin of error that they're working with here.
In terms of the movement? Oh, wow. That's phenomenal.
Yeah. And they haven't tested it in humans yet, but they have tested it on turkeys. It's gone very well. They're hoping to test it on humans in the next couple of years here. And just to run through the advantages compared to existing prosthetics really quickly, the one that will affect users the most is the fact that you have the more natural control that you don't have to really learn. You can pretty much get it and go. Right. And on that note, it is also less invasive to implant these little beads because they're literally the size of like a peppercorn. They're tiny.
Everything's the size of a peppercorn.
Everything's the size of a peppercorn today. Good technology is little. And I think because of that, although I'm not sure, it was mentioned in one of the articles, it will face lower regulatory barriers than the existing electromyography, I would imagine, just because that surgery is not as intense, but I'm not sure. Yeah. It's also supposed to be cheaper than the existing prosthetics.
So we've got another case where regulation is stifling people's chances to have a better life.
Mm-hmm. But that doesn't dull the fact that this is still an exciting technology that's going to improve the lives of probably at some point millions of amputees. Yeah. And Hugh Hare noted in one of the articles that although this technology is designed with amputees in mind, they're thinking it could also help other patients, for example, stroke patients, who, when they're just starting to regain, for those of you who don't know, when you have a stroke, you typically lose control often of half of your body.
Yeah.
And it takes a while to gain it back. Some patients never regain it fully.
Yeah, it's actually a good, might be usul thing for people to know. It's a good way of spotting when somebody's having a stroke is if half of their face.
Yeah, half their face droops. Exactly. Yeah. And so, and there are other conditions as well where you experience extreme muscle weakness. It makes it really hard for you to control your limbs. And so one of the ways that they typically deal with that is through an exoskeleton, which sounds like something that belongs on a bug, but it's
or some kind of, just science fiction military gear that goes, like Iron Man suit kind of thing.
Right. But the idea is it's some sort of a supportive structure that helps you move more easily. And Hera thinks that this technology could be implemented into those exoskeletons to give stroke patients and others with, deteriorating muscles better control over their bodies as well. So
yeah, I think the ideal you want to move towards is where the machine becomes part of you effectively, where you can just control it as part of your body.
Exactly. Yes. And this is a huge step forward towards that.
Yeah.
I think we're ready to move on to honorable mentions.
Yes. So both of my honorable mentions have a sort of linking theme between them today.
See if you can spot it.
Yeah, but we've got yours in between, obviously. So I will start out by talking about a company called Waymo, who are actually a company set up by Alphabet. And yes, last week you talked about another of Alphabet's little companies or projects.
Yes, Alphabet also owns DeepMind, the UK-based company that developed the AI program that will can predict the protein structures.
Yeah, so that's a big medical innovation, and this week is a sort of robotics innovation and a transportation one, because Waymo was originally set up as the Google self-driving car project. But they've sort of moved more into the heavy haulage dimension now, and they're building a hub near Dallas, which will be a hub for their self-driving trucks. I'm making all the mistakes on this one. For their self-driving trucks, but when I say truck, I don't mean like a Ford F-150. I mean a full-size, what you call them 18-wheelers or semis. We call them lorries, like a big freight carrying vehicle. And they're partnering with another company called Ryder with a Y, of course, who are a rental company for vehicles. So these trucks will be available from this hub for hire for potential customers. So that's the first time that autonomous self-driving heavy haulage has been an option for people wanting to ship a large amount of goods. So briefly talk about why I think this is a really promising innovation. For one thing, road safety. And I was in the US recently, and I was quite taken by the speed. I mean, I've been before, but I hadn't driven in the US until this time. And I was somewhat taken by the speed with which like large trucks belt down the interstate. And so in this country, they're limited to 60 miles an hour, and they're always like, the slow thing on the motorway that you have to kind of overtake all the time. Whereas in the US, they were just creaming through and overtaking us. And I was thinking, these things are heavy.
Passing us, honey. They were passing us.
Well, as opposed to
overtaking us.
Do you not using the term overtaking in America, like when you? Oh dear.
No.
Okay. No, well, yeah. Anyway, they were belting along, and I could just my brain just like has physics installed on it, and I can just see the potential outcome of situations like this, and the size and mass of these things just traveling downhill, especially. And but more than that, when road accidents happen, they're a lot worse if a truck is involved than if it's just between cars a lot of the time. And when there's ice and conditions like that, and just having vehicles like that be under automatic control. And this is no attack on truck drivers like my uncle's one. It's an impressive job to do, and have a lot of respect for them. But it's just a fact of reality that a machine is going to be better at that than a human being is, in terms of following the rules properly and having a proper understanding of what to do in icy conditions and all these sorts of things.
Well, and being aware and awake. These truck drivers are often on the road for 10 plus hours at a time, and you can't stay awake that long.
Yeah, I mean, so it's different over here again because there are limitations on how long people can drive for. But
varies by state in the US.
It's a much larger country, and it's more even on a 2-hour journey, you can miss things, you cannot see stuff. A car gets in front of you and it's out of your range of view, and you run into it without knowing. And whereas the machine's got sensors in all directions, it knows exactly what's around it all the time. It knows what the conditions under the wheels are. It can feel everything. It can instantly correct for a skid or something. Like just the safety benefits of this are enormous. On top of which, hopefully, I think it would lead to a more efficient, more reliable service for customers as well. Maybe cheaper in the long run.
I imagine because you wouldn't have as much labor.
Well, that's one aspect of it, yeah. And I think just the efficiency of the operation, like they don't need to take breaks and that kind of thing as well, is going to reduce costs. On the flip side of that, they will need maintenance and programming and things like that. And that also ties into the other thing, which is, people are going to somewhat understandably, I think, be concerned about job losses. But just try and like zoom out for a minute and think. Well, firstly, sort of 2 points here. There's a practical point and a moral point. The practical point is that, just consider all of the technologies from the past that we no longer use. All the people who worked in stables when we used horses to get around and to move freight and, for all sorts of purposes, who didn't have jobs anymore when those went away, or all the people who maintained steam engines, all the people who worked switchboards in the telephone centers, typists, all these things that we just don't need anymore. And they're not all on the streets. They find new jobs, they retrain, and the same thing will happen again. And we don't just keep the old way of doing things going. I mean, you do a bit of that for heritage purposes, but you don't keep the old way of things going just to keep people in jobs. That brings you on to the moral point, is that an industry doesn't exist to give people jobs. An industry exists to deliver a service. And if it's not the best way of delivering that service anymore, then it goes and it gets replaced with what is, and we're all better off for that. So but obviously the reason, the connection between the previous point and this point is that these things still need human beings. Like, whatever it may seem like, I don't think we're anywhere near machines being able to care for themselves and run everything by themselves. Like, somebody needs to orchestrate this whole operation, maintain it, look after it, program it. So this will create jobs as well as replace them. So I don't really see any other way of looking at this than a really positive innovation that has a lot of exciting potential. And I have Blade Runner, the recent Blade Runner movie in my mind, where there's a scene where it's just all autonomous trucks driving up and down a freeway, and they don't even have cabs. It's just like a container just going along by itself. And I kind of have I mean, Blade Runner isn't the best vision of the future, but that part of it was quite cool. And I have that image in my head of just a freeway of completely self-guided vehicles running along. I think that's quite exciting.
Some people get concerned about the ethical decisions that will need to be made in the rare case that a truck is going to crash and it could hurt somebody in an autonomous, self-driving vehicle. But I think the important point there is to keep it in perspective and realize that that's going to be such a tiny fraction of the number of car crashes that we're experiencing now, and the number of people that's injuring and killing. So.
Yeah, you are just the nature of humans and machines. You are going to have more times that a human being makes some mistakes and causes an accident than a machine does. And it's just a reality. If you're going to use any form of technology, then there's going to be accidents from time to time. But if you don't use technology, you're going to die a lot more than if you do. So the accidents and fatalities are a part of life, and we seek to minimize them as best we can. But you can't challenge an innovation on every single time it goes wrong.
Indeed. So the next honorable mention is that just outside of Japan, they have tested a rotating detonation engine. So this test was done by the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, called JAXA for short. This is like the Japanese version of NASA, essentially. And they did this test in July. And the test that they ran is on like I said, a rotating detonation engine, which basically works by using controlled explosions that run in a loop, hence rotation bit. And the benefit of these engines is that they're smaller, lighter, and more fuel efficient than conventional rocket engines. So the idea is you'd be able to, use less fuel. One article I read said like 25% less fuel. And things being lighter also helps when you're trying to move things into space. So some people have worked on these kinds of engines before, but the significant new thing here is that they did successfully do a test from up in the air. I think it was 146 miles up.
Yeah, so about 230 kilometers up. And just to say, this isn't currently a practical solution for lifting from the ground to space. This is useful for moving around once you're in space.
Right. The article I was reading, the first article I found, was talking about the benefits of once you're already like on a space station and you want to go visit another planet or something.
Yeah.
Go look at something. That would be the type of thing that this would be used for.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's easy to sort of conceive of like moon missions and Mars missions being done the way Apollo was, where you launch from the ground and then go straight there. But probably the more realistic way for that to happen is the spacecraft is built in orbit or assembled in orbit and then just launches. It doesn't launch from the ground, it launches from a station.
And for that kind of purpose, a small light engine is what you want.
Yeah,
You can't be carrying around a ton of extra weight when you're doing these kinds of things.
Yeah, you don't want. Yeah, just rocket engines are a fast burn, drag racer solution of just all the power right now. And whereas the only other way of propelling really at the moment is other experimental technologies like solar sails and things, but ion engines is the main other one, and those are just so slow. They just fire little particles out one at a time, and you barely gain any speed in the course of a couple of days, but over the course of a year or two you build up enough speed to travel interplanetary. But that's not feasible if you want to take people to Mars or something like commercial applications, mine asteroids, things like that. So this is a nice halfway house between the two if it works.
Right. And so they're billing this test as a success. I would say it's a success with a slight caveat, which is that they were hoping it would have a thrust much more similar to a conventional rocket engine. Otherwise, it's not really that useful, is it? But it didn't have that. To put it in numbers, it had a thrust of 500 newtons, which compared to, was it the Delta IV rocket, which has
well, yeah, I mean the Delta IV is a huge rocket, like
right.
That's sort of punching in the big league, but yeah,
to put that in perspective, one of their engines has 3 million newtons, it produces that much thrust. So this is a fraction of even a relatively small conventional rocket. This is a fraction of the thrust that these things have. So that's not quite what they were, as much as they were hoping for. However, once you've got the thing going and it does work, then you can make improvements from there. So it's still a significant step forward. And hopefully, most of the space exploration right now is being done by state agencies, but more and more people are dipping into that field. We've talked about that a little bit on the show already, and hopefully even deep space exploration will be a commercial venture soon. So these are the type of innovations we need to make that happen.
And one of our sister shows, the Hero Show, Robert has talked a bit about Apollo 11 and the fact that the state does have some legitimate role in spaceflight from a defense point of view. So there is going to be some overlap there necessarily in the research and development.
Yes. Yeah, if rockets are your thing, definitely check out the episode of the Hero Show in which Robert and Andy talk about Apollo 11. It's very inspiring.
Cool.
They're a bit more long-winded than we are. Their shows are more like an hour long. Good guys, though.
My other honorable is a company that a lot of you hopefully may have heard of called Boston Dynamics. And those who have will have spotted the connection to my other honorable already. And we actually drove past their office a couple of weeks ago, which was a nice surprise. We were just driving around Boston on our way out of Boston. Actually, I saw a building. I was like, "Oh, that's Boston Dynamics. They're the people who make the robots." And one of their robots, and these are actual robots, these are anthropomorphic, human-shaped bipedal robots. Well, they make the four-leg ones as well, the dog ones. But I actually saw one of those in our hotel, didn't we? We were in Boston.
We did see So we were in, for brief explanation, we were in Massachusetts for TOSCon 2021, which is the annual conference that our organization, Objective Standard Institute, puts on every year. This year was in Newton, Massachusetts. So that's why we were in the area. And they were there the first day, I think, that we were there, and showing one of their little, it looked like a dog style robots.
So the innovation here is that one of their bipedal robots, called Atlas, interestingly, completed a parkour run. So parkour is it began in France, but it sort of spread over the world. Like 2006 time, it was a big phenomenon where people would run around cities and jump between roofs and all over staircases and things. All these just improbable things most of us couldn't begin to do.
Impressive, really.
Yeah, and so this robot completed a parkour course. Now, it wasn't out in the streets jumping between buildings. They may do that at some point, God knows. But at the moment, it was just on this sort of indoor obstacle course. But it's so impressive. We talk about the dog ones and the human ones, but the four-legged arrangement. There's sort of a reason that most animals have four legs, is that that's a much more stable situation than two. And balancing something on 2 points of support is not easy. The chairs don't have two legs. Can you imagine if they did? And people talk about, if anyone has seen Firefly or Prometheus, like the idea that a spaceship could have two rockets, one on each side, and balance like that is, it just does, it would make much more sense to have four or three, because having that third position just gives you so much more stability. And so it was in the early days of Boston Dynamics. If people have seen the videos, it was very difficult to even get them to stand up and walk along in a straight line. Like it's so wobbly. So and they had to develop all of this software to keep the thing balanced. All of these motors that could just and hydraulics that could just instantly relay those commands. And so if you just as a test by yourself, just go and stand in a room and just stand up and pay attention to what your body's doing, which the stuff you just don't pay attention to normally. And you may notice after a while that just to stand still on the spot, your body is making these constant corrections. Like your hips will just adjust all the time just to keep you upright.
If you're impatient, you want to do this faster, do it on one foot, but that doesn't make the point as well.
Because you're not used to standing on one foot, but just to
do it with your eyes closed.
It's an interesting idea actually. But if you've ever seen somebody faint, like as soon as you lose consciousness, you're on the floor. Like it's just such a precarious idea to have this top heavy thing standing up on two legs. And we have very high center of gravity because we've got these huge brains. But with the robots, their center of gravity is a bit lower, but to get them to balance, let alone walk and run, it was a huge process of engineering. And now they've got them dancing and jumping and leapfrogging and twirling, and it's incredibly impressive. So there's two quick things I want to talk about, a bit like with the trucks. One is the sort of the benefit to humankind. And I'll talk about military applications in a moment because that's sort of on the other side. But this is a thing that can go into situations where you don't want a human being and do the work of what's currently done by a human being. Like if you're in a disaster situation, instead of having brave firemen running into a situation, if you could have these guys going in instead, and they could probably achieve things that a human being can't. You could probably lift weights that we couldn't. They can sense where somebody is who's trapped. They could read vital signs from heat and things like that. Just that would be so much better for recovering from situations like we saw in Florida a couple of months ago and things like that. Just disaster relief, scientific research in hostile environments, in the Arctic, in really hot environments, on other planets, things like that. Working on spacecraft in orbit, all these sorts of situations where a human being requires protective clothing and can't easily operate in hot factories, places where risk of injury and death is high. Just and having them be sort of more capable than a human being, they can get a human being out of danger, and then they can do more in that situation as well. So some just very exciting ways in which these things could save lives, could get more financial activity out of something, can explore, can develop. And then to sort of address the other side of that is that I think a lot of people have concerns when they see these robots about their application to the military and to policing as well, I think. And, I think I can understand that to a degree, but I would rather have, firstly, there's several levels to this. Firstly, if we need to be in a war, I'd rather be sending machines to do it than human beings, just because of those human beings' lives. Secondly, a machine that makes it a bit like with the trucks, a machine that makes an error, is probably a lot less likely than a soldier making an error, because again, just human beings, the nature of human beings, and this is a tiny minority of soldiers, I'm sure, but some very horrific stuff came out of Iraq, where soldiers in the combat zone did some stuff that you really don't want them doing, and a machine's certainly not going to do that kind of thing. What a machine does depends on how it's programmed, and so really whether machines are used well in law enforcement and military situations or not depends on the laws and the government. So that's the situation. And in a dictatorship situation, having a military robot coming up at you and trying to enforce the law is terrifying, but then so is having a human do the same thing, as people in places like Hong Kong know all too well. So I think it's just another case where the technology moves on, and it will balance out, and the moral questions remain the same. It's just what tool is being used to do the thing. Mm-hmm. But I do want to put one little caveat on that, which is that a lot of people may have seen a video of Boston Dynamics robots, running around with guns and being punched and pushed over, and all this stuff. It looks like it's like the prelude to iRobot, like they're suddenly going to rebel and take over because they're sick of being abused or something. Again, AI is nowhere near that, but also that wasn't actually Prosthetics robots. That was Corridor Crew, which is a visual effects company that I follow on YouTube. They do really great movie reviews, but they did that as a demonstration of how motion capture works. That's the technology that they used to make Gollum in Lord of the Rings and the Planet of the Apes movies characters, like where a human being is covered in dots and a computer models a CGI character onto them. And that's what that was. That wasn't even a real video. That was just a visual effects demonstration, but everyone shared it thinking it was the real thing, and people had a big old freak out. So the moral of the story there is,
don't take things at face value.
Yeah, apply a healthy, serving of salt to anything you see on the internet, and look into where it's from before drawing conclusions based on it. So I'm sure our viewers are smart enough to do that a lot of the time, but in that particular instance, that wasn't the real thing. They're not quite there yet.
All right. So to wrap it up, we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about emberometers, which is a device that will hopefully help us cope better with wildfires.
So this is emberometer, not...
Yes.
Because I heard it the first time, it's embryometer, like it monitors the baby's vital signs or something.
No. Emberometer. And I think prevention would be the better route, and wildfire management could be a topic for another day.
Or forest management.
Forest management for wildfire prevention and doing controlled burns and things like that. But that's a topic for another day. The problem that we're facing now, well, not me personally, but a number of places like California and Australia are facing, is that they're having these massive wildfires. And these things are spreading unpredictably, and specifically, embers are flying and helping to spread this. So if you think about it, if you've ever been at like a campfire or something, little embers spit out, and they spit out a couple of feet and go out in the grass usually. In worst case scenario, somebody gets a little burn on their foot. But think about this on a larger scale. You've got a giant wildfire, devouring trees. The embers are going to be much larger, fly much farther, and consequently be much more dangerous. So to be specific, embers from wildfires can fly like 24 miles away and catch a building on fire. And in fact, they often do.
Or they can land in another forest and start a new fire.
Start another fire.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we haven't really figured out a way to cope with that yet, partially because embers are really unpredictable. They go any which way. Again, if you think back to a campfire, there's no good way, unless the wind is really strongly blowing in one direction. There's no good way to predict where the embers are going to land. And there's no good way to predict how big they're going to be, or what, how hot they're going to be when they do land. And so far, the only way of measuring this kind of thing was to put out pans of water and catch the embers that you could, and then take them back to the lab and study them there.
Real high-tech solution.
Very high-tech. And you could glean some things from that. Obviously, they'd made it into the pan, so they had gotten that far, and you could get an idea of the size, but you didn't really know.
It inverts the expression, doesn't it? It's out of the fire and into the pan.
Exactly. Yes. But you could only get limited information from that. You could figure out how big they were, where they had actually landed, but you didn't know how fast they'd come, how hot they were when they got there. There are all kinds of variables that we just didn't know. And so this new device, this emberometer, measures all of those things. It stands up on a stand similar to like a camera tripod, and it measures the speed, size, shape, and trajectory of the embers that are going by it all around it, like 360.
That's impressive.
Yes, and they've tested its accuracy. It's very, very good. I didn't see a percentage, but it was very high. So obviously the benefits of all of this would be that if we can better predict where embers are going, we can protect buildings and people accordingly, hopefully fire like forests too, and control wildfires a lot better, get people out if we need to for safety purposes, and build homes in such a way that they're more protected. The caveat I want to put on this one is that this work is being done by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a U.S. government agency. that is developing these with an eye toward requiring that builders take into account this data, and they'll use the data to create standards that builders must adhere to. And the problem with that is whenever you have more restrictions and whenever you have more regulations, that implies a higher cost, both in terms of actual money, and that cost usually gets passed to the consumer, at least in part, and in terms of just actual difficulty of compliance, which means that fewer people are going to want to build homes, and the housing crisis, which is, from what I understand, quite intense in California, will be exacerbated.
Yeah.
You want to consider that most companies actually do have their customers' interest at heart, because it's not good business to build homes that don't stand up to the conditions they're being put in. If you think back to Tom already mentioned the apartment building that collapsed in Florida. Imagine being the builder of that apartment building right now, especially in the days of social media. If you're responsible for something bad that you could have prevented, especially once we have this kind of data available, that doesn't look good for you.
Yeah, I mean, go look at China, where buildings fall down left, right, and center all the time, and there's some
they
really
have
good...
so many restrictions.
Well, and there's just one, it's just the state doing the whole thing. So it's just boggles the mind, really.
Right. But I'd like to end on a positive note. Despite that little negative caveat I wanted to make clear, this is still really interesting technology that will hopefully save property and save lives. So it's still a net positive, even though there is that caveat there.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's all we have for today.
Yeah. So shall I summarize quickly?
Please do.
I started the main section by talking about a very exciting breakthrough in nuclear fusion. And then you went on and talked about magnetically controlled prosthetic limbs. So both of those very upbeat.
Magnetometry. Yes.
You can remember. You've got that off by heart now.
And for our honorable mentions, Tom talked about Waymo's self-driving trucks, and I continued with the test of the rotating detonation engine in Japan. And then you talked about Boston Dynamics robot named Atlas doing parkour, which is really cool. And I finished us up by talking about the Emberometer. So links will always be in the description. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.